business we'll go straight on to is a debate on a motion 24225 in the name of Kate Forbes on the Scottish rate resolution. Members should note that the question will be put on the motion immediately following conclusion of the debate. I invite members who wish to speak in the debate to press the request to speak buttons, and I call on Ivan McKee to speak to move the motion. Minister, please.
Are you moving it?
Oh,
Opening speaker.
I'm happy to be corrected. I'm only reading what's written for me. I'm not in charge. I call on the Cabinet Secretary to move the motion, which will be spoken to by Mr Ivan McKee. Have I got that right now?
Apparently so. I moved
That's
the motion.
excellent. Well, off we go. You've moved it. Thank you. I now call on Ivan McKee to speak to the motion.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And that was the choreography that I checked with my with officials earlier, the process apparently is that the Cabinet Secretary moves and then I speak to the motion. I'm delighted to be here to open part 2 of this afternoon's fiscal double-header for those who are gluttons for punishment. And I would like, first of all, to draw the Parliament's attention to the procedural connection between this debate and Rule 9.16.7 of the Standing Orders, which state that a rate resolution must be agreed before stage 3 of the budget bill is able to proceed. Also, as members will be aware, the debate on the rate resolution normally takes place following stage 2 of the budget bill. However, today's debate is taking place after stage 1. Any further delay would have left businesses and payroll operators with insufficient time to ensure their systems would be ready ahead of the start of the new tax year on the 6th of April. We have brought forward today's debate to alleviate any further disruption to them and in recognition that people need stability from the tax system now more than ever. The fact remains, Presiding Officer, that had the UK Government been able to set its budget in timely fashion, businesses and employers would not have faced this uncertainty in the first place. In contrast to the indecision of the UK Government, our budget offers Scotland's people and businesses certainty and stability in times that are anything but certain. On every page of the budget, you will see decisions that have been taken with the coronavirus pandemic to the fore, spending prioritised for the industry's hardest hit, support for our NHS and investment in the future of our economy. Decisions that have been taken without having the full picture of funding available to us. We've been clear that this budget supports Scotland's people and the economic recovery for this year and beyond, providing certainty and stability in the face of disarray caused by Brexit at the hands of the UK Government. Presiding Officer, in 2017, this Government set out its vision for a fairer and more progressive income tax system in Scotland. At the time, a commitment was made that the new 5-band system would remain in place for the duration of this Parliament. The proposals we are debating today deliver on this commitment and maintain our fairer and progressive tax system. Under these proposals, all income tax rates will remain unchanged. The starter and basic rate bands, as well as a higher rate threshold, will increase by inflation, and the top rate threshold will remain frozen at £150,000. During our pre-budget engagement, we heard a clear message from stakeholders across the country. Now is not the time to make significant changes to taxes. Instead, we should be focusing on supporting the people and businesses hardest hit by the pandemic. Leading fiscal commentators such as the IMF and OECD agree that now is not the time to balance the books, and we too have been clear that now is not the time for fiscal consolidation. This budget is about striking the right balance between raising the revenue required to fund our public services and providing certainty for all Scottish taxpayers. A proposed tax package has been supported by key stakeholders, and I would like to share with the Chamber their words. David Lonsdale of the Scottish Retail Consortium wrote that decisions to protect ordinary taxpayers from rises in income tax rates are spot on. Professor Graham Roy from the Fraser of Allender Institute, who said that this wise package provides certainty and stability to households and families who are living in very uncertain times. Certainty and stability, Presiding Officer, our proposals for income tax deliver just that. This Government is committed to ensuring that tax policy is understood and informed by a diverse range of views and perspectives. We have committed to delivering a transparent and outward-focused tax policy-making process. We embrace a collaborative approach to tax policy development, characterised by regular consultation with taxpayers, industry representatives and professional bodies. Ahead of this budget, we engaged with a diverse range of stakeholders on tax policy. This engagement included a pre-budget consultation which showed a broad-ranging interest in the devolution of further tax powers and an appetite for broader engagement on tax. We listened to the interest in further devolution of tax powers that has been expressed by stakeholders, and as part of the medium-term financial strategy, we called for the UK Government to use the upcoming fiscal framework review to consider this. This call includes devolving a package of taxes encompassing full income tax powers and full VAT devolution, as well as consideration of other tax powers such as capital gains tax and national insurance. These powers would enable the Scottish Government to shape a recovery that is best suited to Scotland. Indeed, we believe that broad-based engagement of this kind should not be limited to the annual budget cycle, but form part of a wider conversation about the purpose of tax in our society and what tax is designed to achieve. Members will know that in its Stage 1 budget report this week, the Finance Committee called for a national conversation jointly led by Government and the Parliament to include a wide range of voices across Scotland. And I too would like to take this opportunity, although I believe he may be back for Stage 3, to pay tribute to Bruce Crawford and certainly the efforts he took to encourage me when I was first came into this Parliament and sat on his very esteemed committee. We welcome this call from the committee and will work constructively with the successor committee to ensure that this conversation is well grounded and valuable to the public of Scotland. The findings of this conversation will be considered as part of the pre-budget scrutiny of future years, but we want this national engagement on taxes to broaden understanding of the links between tax and spend and the central role of taxes in Scotland's finances. To look afresh at the social contract that underpins tax and spend, which allows Scotland's taxpayers to continue to have access to a wider and better funded range of free-to-access public services than in the rest of the UK, making Scotland an attractive place to live, to work, to study and to do business. Taxes which support our NHS and the industries hardest hit by the pandemic, and taxes which deliver for Scotland. As this parliamentary term draws to an end, it's a good opportunity to reflect on what our decisions on income tax have delivered for Scotland. People in Scotland pay their income tax in the most progressive and fair tax system anywhere in the UK, one that protects low-income earners and raises additional revenue to fund public services. Our decisions mean that for the fourth consecutive year, Scotland will be the lowest taxed part of the UK for the majority of income taxpayers. Yes, we continue to ask those with the broadest shoulders to contribute more, but in return, people living in Scotland continue to have access to the widest range of public services available anywhere in the UK. This is progressive tax policy in action. Members will be aware that income tax outturn data is only available with a significant time lag. Therefore, it was only September last year that we got the first insight into how our income tax reform in 2018-19 had performed. And what did this data show? It showed that Scottish tax receipts grew faster than in the rest of the UK between 2017-18 and 2018-19. As a result, Scotland raised £119 million over and above the corresponding block grant adjustment, largely thanks to our policy changes. This positive outlook has continued into 2019-20. Recently published data by HMRC suggests that Scottish receipts continue to grow faster than in the rest of the UK between 2018-19 and 2019-20. And if we look across all of this parliamentary term, the latest forecasts from the Scottish Fiscal Commission and the Office for Budget Responsibility tell us that over the 5 years since 2017-18, Scottish income tax is expected to cumulatively raise around £930 million more than the corresponding block grant adjustments. This is extra money we've been able to invest in our NHS, in our education system and in tackling the climate emergency. There can be no firmer evidence that our tax policies are delivering for the people of Scotland. Presiding Officer, in concluding, I recognise that people across the country are dealing with significant economic and social impacts brought on by the pandemic. Right now, they need certainty and stability from their tax system, and this policy delivers just that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. Now I call on Murdo Fraser to open the Conservatives. Mr Fraser, please.
Well, thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I welcome this debate on the rate resolution? It is a peculiarity of the budget process that we have to set the rates resolution before we finally vote on the budget. And we don't at this stage know the final overall size of the budget, or indeed how it will be allocated, but here we are, and it's an important part of the process. And without agreeing a rates resolution, there would of course be no income tax collected at all in Scotland. Some of my colleagues might welcome that prospect. It might be an interesting foretaste of what an independent Scotland might look like with that large black hole in the public finances, but it is probably not a responsible way in which to proceed at the present time. Now, let's not forget, Presiding Officer, when we consider our approach to this, that the SNP were elected on the manifesto promise not to raise taxes. The manifesto back in 2016 pledged, and I quote, "We will freeze the basic rate of income tax throughout the next Parliament to protect those on low and middle incomes." And indeed, during the election debates, Nicola Sturgeon said herself, "I have been very clear that this government will not increase income tax." And I could bore the chamber for hours with similar quotes from SNP figures, maybe even the Finance Secretary herself, making similar pledges, which of course have all now been broken, because everyone earning more than around £27,000 pays more tax than their equivalents south of the border. Many of these are basic rate taxpayers, paying much more. And there is, as we've raised many times before, a particular concern for those earning between £43,000 and £50,000, paying with tax at the marginal rate of over 50%, which is a real disincentive for people in that tax bracket who want to work harder. And of course, that's not the only tax promise that the SNP have broken, because they made another pledge at election time. They promised to raise the personal allowance to £12,750. Another pledge that they have broken. So that's two broken promises just in the course of one Parliament on tax from the SNP. Now, that said, Deputy Presiding Officer, I welcome the fact that we are not seeing any further tax increases in the current year. And while this does not narrow the gap with the rest of the UK, at least it does not make matters any worse. It is classic Keynesian economics, at a time of an economic downturn, to increase spending and to reduce taxation. The Scottish Government is not choosing to reduce taxation. We'll see what the Chancellor decides to do for the other parts of the UK in his budget next week. But clearly, to increase taxes at this time would go against all orthodox economic thinking. And indeed, the Minister in his remarks did give a nod to that idea. This is not the time for fiscal consolidation. It might be different in the long run. Of course, we await to see again what the Chancellor announced in the UK budget next week, but I'd be very surprised if we took any steps to increase personal taxation at this time. Subsequent years, the story might be different. There may be a need to increase taxes to help reduce borrowing and then start to make repayments, but now is not the time to do that, and in that respect, the Minister and I are in the same place. We agree with that general approach. Whether that meeting of minds will last much longer, well, remains to be seen. But for now, I think we agree that this is a sensible approach towards taxation, although we would prefer if we were going more towards meeting the tax rates in the rest of the UK. Because we do have to be very careful about increasing tax divergence between Scotland and down south. Scotland needs to be a competitive place to live, work and do business. Our aspiration as a party is to see taxes in Scotland competitive relative to the rest of the UK. That's the way we attract people to come and live in Scotland, and that ambition is important now as ever it was. Yeah, I've got time, I'll give way. Yeah.
And you'll get your time back too, Mr Fraser. Mr Mason.
Thank you. I thank the member for giving way. Would you accept that people are attracted to Scotland for a whole range of reasons, and for most people the tax rate is not the dominant one, but it's the quality of education, the quality of the health service and the friendly people?
Murdo Fraser.
Well, indeed, Mr Mason is right. There are all sorts of factors why people come to Scotland or leave Scotland. If I were him, I'd be very nervous about praising the quality of the education system in Scotland, given certainly what we hear from all those academics and experts comparing the performance of Scotland's education system recently with other parts of the world where we seem to be slipping down international league tables. There's a lot of work to do in that area if we are to make Scotland as attractive as it should be to people who want to come here to educate their children. I want to say a little bit about the fiscal framework, which was mentioned in the earlier debate, but it's relevant here too, because what the fiscal framework does, of course, is it protects public spending in Scotland, providing tax revenues in Scotland remain similar to those in other parts of the UK. And that's very important. It's going to be particularly important if we end up in a period of a shrinking economy and a falling set of tax revenues, because the Finance Secretary will not have to worry about a falling budget in that scenario because her budget is protected from any reductions, unlike the budgets of all these other countries she likes talking about who are facing a squeeze on their income because of the fiscal framework, a fiscal framework, of course, that the current Deputy First Minister negotiated on behalf of the Scottish Government, a fiscal framework which protects the levels of spending in Scotland, and we should welcome that. In the budget for the current year, of course, the Finance Secretary had to account for £300 million of negative reconciliations arising from the 2018-19 budget period due to the overestimate of taxes raised in that period. But the fiscal framework allows the Scottish Government to borrow money in order to fill that hole, which is a very welcome initiative. And we also know that the tax changes introduced by the SNP and Government have not raised as much money as they predicted. I remember when these tax changes were put through by the Finance Secretary's predecessor, I remember claims made this would raise £500 million up to £600 million. And the Minister, in his opening remarks, gave the game away, because, in fact, they only raised in the last year some £119 million, much less than was originally claimed, and that suggests that raising taxes is not a one-way bet in terms of getting additional revenue, as the Minister seemed to suggest. If I have time.
Very briefly, yes, very briefly.
I just clarify that point. The point I made exactly was that £119 million reflect the better performance of income tax raising in Scotland compared to the rest of the UK, and that adds up to a total of £930 million over the lifetime of this Parliament, a positive reflection on the tax policies that this Government has undertaken over that period.
Thank you. Mr Fraser.
That's a very long intervention, but of course the Minister did in fact say to me, and if he checks the record he'll see this, because I listened very carefully, 119 million included the tax changes that were made, so that it was inclusive of that figure. Presiding Officer, my time is up. Can I just say in closing, we cannot support the rates resolution before us because it doesn't go far enough, but we will not oppose it. Governments have a duty to levy taxes to pay for public services. Without the rates resolution going through, that would not be possible, and we will therefore abstain to let this pass. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There is some time for interventions. I now call on Jackie Bailey for Open for Labour. Ms Bailey, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Since the Government took charge of Scottish income tax rates, we on these benches have been critical of how they've used these powers. For years, the SNP demanded that income tax rates should be devolved so that they could introduce more progressive policies. Yet, since they have taken charge, what we have seen is not much more than tinkering around the edges. Now, I know that the Finance Secretary will probably tell me that the most well-off taxpayers in Scotland will be paying more than they would in England. I know she'll probably say that the Government have introduced additional rates and bans, but in the application of these powers, year after year, they have failed to make the most of them. And this year, we see the conclusion of this timid approach, with the lowest earners being given a tax cut worth effectively 12%, while the top earners, those bringing in more than £150,000 a year, get effectively a cut worth £33. My question to the Finance Secretary is, how is that progressive? How can it be that the Government are proposing income tax rates that provide so little help to those on the lowest pay? Many are the very workers who the Government applauded during the pandemic. But, Presiding Officer, we know that this year's tax rates are a holding position in advance of an election just weeks away, a holding position as the Government anticipates more money coming from UK Treasury to fill the gap. So this proposal tells us very little about how the Government might approach the recovery from coronavirus in the years ahead. It would be unacceptable for the burden of this crisis to fall on those with the lowest incomes. While it may be true that many people on higher incomes have actually managed to save more over the past year, that's not true for those on low incomes. Many have struggled to make ends meet. In the coming years, the Government cannot replicate this year's approach and hand a larger saving to those who already have far more to fall back on. So I welcome the fact that low earners will not see a tax rise next year, and that's why we've also welcomed the council tax freeze. When people are facing such a strain on their family finances, we cannot and should not be asking them to pay more, particularly at a time when the Scottish Government is benefiting from UK Government borrowing at historically low levels. But I ask the Finance Secretary to consider carefully in future how she matches her words about progressive taxation with action. It is only because of the significant increases in spending available from the UK Government borrowing that the Finance Secretary can meet all her commitments this year. In future years, that may not be as readily available, and at that time, the burden cannot fall on those other than with the broadest shoulders. Presiding Officer, the coming years are going to challenge the government to be more radical, to be more innovative with the public finances. If it wants to maintain all the commitments it has made, money is going to need to be found somewhere. We know that the government already plans to borrow to deal with negative income tax reconciliations in future years. We know that the Cabinet Secretary has been seeking additional borrowing powers from the UK government as part of the fiscal framework review. But if we are to have sustainable public finances that can provide the basis for economic growth in Scotland, borrowing and taxation will not go far enough. The Finance Secretary needs to take action to restart our economy and, at the very least, catch us up with the rest of the UK. The medium-term financial strategy makes abundantly clear that the Scottish Government is over-reliant on tax receipts from sectors that are disproportionately affected by COVID-19. Recovery means redressing that balance. It means planning for an economy that is going to look very different from the one we had before coronavirus. The government cannot make the same mistakes as they made after the last financial crisis, where Scotland was still trying to catch up more than 10 years on from that shock. We cannot afford another anaemic recovery. Presiding Officer, Labour will not vote against the rates resolution today, but we do so with a warning that the government cannot continue with a piecemeal approach to taxation and our economy as a whole. For future prosperity, we must grow our tax base. We need to help low earners and small businesses, and we need to ask those with the broadest shoulders to contribute their fair share. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms Bailey. And I now call on Willie Reddy to open to Liberal Democrats. Mr Rennie, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. This is like a blast from the past. The debates of yesteryear that we used to argue about tax rises and whether we would get extra revenues or whether there was going to be a massive cut to public services as a result. It's great to be back in that. In fact, you forget about all the debates that we had previously, but it does remind you that at the last election, the SNP didn't propose a tax rise and then went on to increase it. Unlike us, where we were honest about the election, we said we should put a penny on income tax for a modest rise, for a colossal big return, so we could invest in education. That's what we followed through on later. But it was also a reminder that the Conservatives were dead against any tax rise. I seem to remember that, and Murdo Fraser corroborated that today. But it's quite interesting now that Murdo Fraser is not proposing to reverse that tax rise. So appalled is he about that tax rise that he's decided to leave it alone. There's no proposals, as far as I've seen, from the Conservatives that they're proposing to reverse those tax rises. In fact, I remember having a debate with Jamie Green during the election campaign where he was unable to say whether he was going to actually cut the tax to reverse it. So confused are the Conservatives about whether they actually support this or not. But nevertheless, we've moved on slightly. And I think what's really important is that this year we have stability, because I don't think there's any appetite at all from the public to have an increase in taxes at this time. Consumer confidence is really fragile. We need to make sure that in the middle of the pandemic, when people's personal finances are tight, that we give them the support that they need. And to be frank, when we're borrowing such colossal sums of money, any tax rise would actually just be a drop in the ocean in comparison. So I don't think there's any appetite for any tax rises, and that's why we'll support the Scottish rate resolution today. But I think there's also a wider lesson that we also need to learn, and that's because I think this chamber has changed in terms of the debate on budgets. In previous years, we would have just debated with the thought in our mind about who would benefit from extra funds or a cut in services. That was our almost sole interest. But now at least we're thinking about the pockets of the taxpayer, and we have to balance those two considerations much more effectively. And I think this, therefore, budget debates and tax resolution debates are much more rounded and considered, that we do think about all of the different interest groups in budget considerations. And that, I think, makes it a much healthier place because we would always just argue about where was the extra money going to go or where are the cuts going to be made. And I think that has changed now, and I think that is a healthy change. But also I think there is another argument, and this will take longer for us to make the proper assessments, that when you're introducing tax rises, you need to make sure that the intended effect of those tax rises actually follow through, so that you can measure the impact of them. You can test the outcomes on individuals. You can test the behavioural change, because there's many claims about behavioural change that would result in any tax rise. And we need to measure all of that. Now, that's going to be difficult because of the intervening pandemic. But we should, as a discipline, I believe, make sure that we test the impact of that. And we do test the claims about behavioural change. Because as far as I saw in the pre-pandemic period, we didn't have mass behavioural change. We didn't have people exiting Scotland to go somewhere else because of those modest tax rises. But that trust is fragile. We need to be careful when we make decisions about taxes so that we do maintain the trust and the confidence of the taxpayers. And with that, I will close. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr Rennie. I now call Patrick Harvey to open for the Green Party. Mr Harvey, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This session of Parliament has seen the only substantial tax reform since devolution, a new 5-band system of income tax, closely modelled on what the Scottish Greens proposed at the last election. And as a few other members already have, I think it's worth recalling what the other parties proposed at that point. Labour and the Lib Dems wanted to raise income tax at the basic rate, increasing what low earners pay, those who can least afford it. The Conservatives naturally wanted big tax cuts for the richest, funded by cuts from the public services that everybody else depends on. The SNP, meanwhile, proposed only the most timid possible change by not copying the UK government's ideas. And they also wanted a new extra personal tax allowance for Scotland, which would mostly benefit high-income households and which would have given nothing at all to those in most need. I'm very pleased that we not only blocked that damaging proposal, but we shifted the debate on tax completely and won through on the Green proposal to raise more revenue from those who can afford it, while protecting everybody on a low or a middle income. Has that change gone as far as it could? As far as we would like? No. And the SNP's return to threshold increases that benefit high earners is not something that we support. But in the middle of the pandemic, I have to accept that this isn't the time for a further radical shake-up of the system. So we won't vote for this rate resolution, but we will allow it to go through to prevent the budget as a whole from falling. Let me also say, though, something about the future. As the Finance and Constitution Committee has agreed, we need to re-examine the persistent structural inequalities in our society, which have been exacerbated by the current crisis. And as Bruce Crawford quoted in the previous debate, the Stage 1 budget debate, that means redistribution. It means closing the wealth and income inequality gaps in our society. If we're going to do that, we need, yes, a national conversation, but really a deep re-examination of the role of tax policy. That's in Scotland, it's in the UK, but actually all governments are going to have to look creatively at the role of tax in the coming fiscal consolidation, instead of returning to the brutality of austerity. That must mean dropping this silly, shallow rhetoric that we keep on hearing, claims about being the highest or the lowest taxed part of the UK. That kind of language is grounded in the idea of tax competition, the idea that each jurisdiction must compete to be the lowest taxed area. Tax competition is one of the things that has led to the growth of inequality and the hoarding of wealth by the few. The implication of this kind of language is that tax is a bad thing in principle, and we're going to have to reject that. The deep re-examination of tax policy that we need also must mean looking again at income tax for high earners, but it also has to mean finally addressing the long overdue reform of local taxation. And it should kill off also the SNP's absurd decision to back Tory free market extremism with free ports, a system that is designed to remove economic activity from the tax base. And finally, it must also mean raising revenue from the COVID profiteers and tackling the legal tax avoidance that takes place on such a huge scale by vastly profitable businesses, and bringing corporate profits back into the scope of taxation after decades of tax cuts to those who need it the least. We'll make a case for radical proposals in the next session. For the time being, we're going to abstain on the rate resolution today.
Thank you very much, Mr Harvey. We now move to the open debate. There's little time in hand for interventions. I call John Mason to be followed by Bill Bowman. Mr Mason, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And so we now move to the other side of the budget equation, namely where the money is to come from to pay for the expenditure that we need and we want. And I have to say I agree with quite a lot of what Patrick Harvey has just said. I do think that we as a country, we need to become more comfortable talking about tax, and not just in the sense that it's a bad thing and that we all want taxes to be as low as possible. I think we all regularly receive campaign emails from various sources, and these have recently included Unite the Union, campaigning about caring for carers, and Unison calling for an NHS pay rise. Now, both were seeking better pay and conditions for low-paid workers, and I have a lot of sympathy for these two campaigns. But neither suggested raising tax to pay for such increased expenditure, as if the money could somehow appear without impacting anywhere else. And no, not from Mr Finlay after his insults to the Cabinet Secretary. I think the section on the tax policy in the Finance Committee report, which has been referred to, is well worth reading, paragraphs 167 to 178. That is calling for an inquiry and debate on a Scottish approach to taxation. Now, I accept that today we are specifically looking at income tax rates, but this does seem like a good time to start thinking of the way ahead. The recovery from the pandemic and how tax fits in as part of that. I do think there is an appetite amongst the public to support the NHS, to pay more for care workers and care homes, and perhaps to pay more tax in order to fund these things. And even the Chambers of Commerce agreed that they would support a debate on tax reform. After all, many businesses who have traditionally argued for lower taxes across the board have been very keen to receive funding from the public purse, which of course is funded in turn by all of our taxes. On top of that, we had Citizens' Assembly report and debate last week, and a key theme of that was the lack of understanding of taxation amongst the public. And yet we know that 99% of the public understand budgeting perfectly well. They have to juggle income and expenditure to get a balance, and they know that we in Parliament need to do so as well. So I would very much support the call that the incoming Parliament and Finance Committee should consider an inquiry and wider debate during the year 21-22, so that the results could impact on the budget in 23-24. Now, moving more specifically to income tax, we heard from witnesses, including the OBR, that fiscal consolidation will be necessary in the medium term, particularly if interest rates rise and the cost of borrowing increases. I do not want to see public spending cut, either in the UK or in Scotland, so at some point we need to look at taxes, including income tax. I take the point that we do not want to damage the recovery by raising taxes too soon and taking money away, which might be better spent with businesses which are struggling. The government makes the point that they want to give certainty and stability, and I do very much support that. Thanks to an increase in the number of bans a while back, and I accept that the Greens were part of that, we have a more progressive system than the UK does. Some people are clearly struggling financially with the hospitality sector and much of retail still closed, workers' hours being reduced, and especially it is clear that women and low-paid workers have been suffering the most. But at the same time, some people are better off because of COVID, probably including most of us here. People on fixed salaries have saved on commuting, meals, nights out, childcare, and a range of other expenditure. So some people could afford to pay a bit more tax. So referring back to the previous debate and the importance of the differential social and economic impact of COVID, I do believe we both need to look at increasing equality, both by targeting our expenditure at those most in need and also by expecting those who are most able to contribute more. Therefore, overall, I am happy to support the Scottish Rate Resolution, But I do think we need to look more closely at taxation in the medium to longer term. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr Mason. Can I call Bill Bowman to be followed by Stuart McMillan?
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Today, the SNP seek this Chamber's agreement to the proposed rates and bans for Scottish income tax. The Scottish Conservatives believe it is unfair to burden hard-working Scots with more taxes or to widen the tax gap between Scotland and the rest of Britain, as the SNP have done in previous years. Willie Rennie mentioned trust, so I will repeat what Murdo Fraser said. The 2016 SNP manifesto said we will freeze the basic rate of income tax throughout the next Parliament to protect those on low and middle incomes. The SNP government broke a manifesto promised and raised taxes for over 1 million Scots. The transition point at which Scots begin to pay more tax than if they lived in the rest of the UK is £27,393, which would have come under the UK government's basic rate. Nicola Sturgeon herself said in this Parliament in 2016, "I have been very clear that this government will not increase income taxes." This is a government elected on a manifesto not to increase income tax rates, and yet it broke that promise. In 2016, almost two-thirds of Scots, 64.6%, voted for parties that promised not to raise taxes in that Scottish Parliament election. The Deputy First Minister declared, "I want to say to teachers and public service workers the length and breadth of the country that the last thing I'm going to do is to put up their taxes." The former Cabinet Secretary, remember him, said, "A government's first point of reference is surely the manifesto on which it was elected. Our first position is to look at the manifesto." Which point?
Does Mr Bowman wish to give way to Mr Arthur?
Okay.
Tom Arthur.
A very good report, Mr Bowman. No, I wish to ask the member if he can confirm that it is still Conservative Party policy that there should be parity between income tax rates in Scotland and the rest of the UK, and whether or not he intends to run in that manifesto in the coming election.
Bill Bowman.
Well, I won't, because I'm not running in the election, so thank you. So,
Mr Bowman.
Thank you. I think Murdo Fraser said that is our aim, that we should reach a parity position at least in due course. So, can I continue?
Mr Bowman, through me, please. Thank you.
Sorry, thank you, Presiding Officer. We say to the Scottish people that there is at least one party in this chamber that is on your side, one party that does not want to see the income tax gap between Scotland and the rest of the UK growing, and one party which opposes this, and that is the Scottish Conservatives. The saddest aspect of all this is that the attack on Scottish income tax is being exacted willingly. Inflicting economic hardship on Scottish workers and risking the Scottish economy is a political choice taken by the SNP. While the SNP might be content to view hard-working Scots as a golden goose, the Scottish Conservatives stand up for public services, we stand up for hard-pressed Scots and families, we stand up for fair taxation, and we stand up for supporting Scotland's economy. Cabinet Secretary, another issue is with our armed forces. Now, our armed forces have never been more visible in Scotland during peacetime, and they have given our vaccine and testing regime a real shot in the arm. I think we all appreciate their contributions. However, in return for this, those members of the forces in Scotland will continue to be taxed more than their colleagues in England. May I just finish my point? Thank you. Thank you. This armed forces tax tab will continue to be picked up by the UK government, so will you fix that major error of your predecessor and restore fairness to them? And I'm particularly concerned about this as in my region, in the northeast of Scotland, we have the Royal Marines located at the fantastic RM Condor base in Arbroath.
Cabinet Secretary Kate Forbes.
I'm just wondering if the member is pushing his UK government to ensure that lower paid armed forces in England get taxed less on a parity with armed forces in Scotland.
Bill Bowman.
Sorry, well, perhaps I should have listened more carefully, but are we discussing the Scottish situation here or the rest of the UK? Well, please.
Secretary Kate Forbes.
Well, considering lower paid taxpayers in Scotland pay less tax, the equivalent applies to the armed forces. So my question is whether he's pressing the UK government to ensure that those in the armed forces that earn less pay less tax.
So I think this is apples and pears, and you're also trying to get away from the issue that basically you don't recognise an unfairness unless it's pointed out to you here, and I'm pointing out an unfairness to you in Scotland. So while we welcome the SNP's decision to listen to the Scottish Conservatives and freeze income tax this year, it doesn't change the fact that within their budget, the SNP choose to prioritise another independence referendum. The Scottish Conservatives managed to stop the SNP hiking taxes this year, but the Cabinet Secretary referred to being a minority government. So if they have a majority, there will be nothing to stop taxes skyrocketing to pay for the SNP's political priorities. So to conclude, the SNP have promised and failed to deliver on local tax reform for more than a decade. We may have a different Finance Secretary now, but the same problems still exist. It's time the SNP were held to account, and they will be. The only way to stop the SNP and get the Scottish Parliament 100% focused on rebuilding Scotland from this crisis is to vote for the Scottish Conservatives today and in May. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr Bowman. And can I call on Stuart McMillan to be followed by Shona Robertson?
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, I do welcome this debate and also the proposals by the Scottish Government for the next financial year regarding the rate resolution. Most people understand the challenges that we have and also are going to continue to go through. And a certainty and a stability approach to reopening the economy and also society is absolutely vital, bearing in mind the instability that we're going to face over the coming 12 months. Furthermore, at the COVID-19 committee this morning, there were some questions actually raised centred around dealing with COVID for next winter, never mind the coming months. Just indicative of the challenges that we're all going to face as a country and society in the next year. The Scottish Government's income tax policy proposals maintain its commitment to a fairer and more progressive tax system protecting lower and middle income taxpayers, whilst also raising additional revenue to invest in public services and also Scotland's economy. And at a time when people across our country are dealing with the economic and social impacts brought upon us by the pandemic, this policy we're discussing today actually delivers the certainty and the stability that our constituents need from the tax system. And even with the challenges ahead, the income tax is still forecast to raise an additional £475 million for the 2021-2022 Scottish budget. And that's money that every single MSP in the next Parliament certainly will welcome, and those currently should welcome, because certainly that money will be reinvested in our public services and the economy as part of the COVID recovery. And also in the next 12 months, they are going to be the most challenging we have ever faced. And therefore, during this time, it is absolutely crucial that we do continue to support households and families. And that's also a reason why I believe that the Scottish Government ensure that no Scottish taxpayer will pay more income tax in 2021-22 than they do now in their current income. In addition, for a fourth consecutive year, more than half of Scottish income taxpayers will pay less tax than if they lived anywhere else in the UK. That's 54% of Scots paying less tax than they would if they lived. Now, it's therefore vital that we don't delay in taking important decisions on income tax. And the much delayed UK budget has already had an impact on the setting of the Scottish Government budget, as has already been discussed today, and the Finance Secretary has highlighted that it's been discussed in this particular debate as well. But the people of Scotland are looking for some certainty over the course of the next 12 months. Also, I listened to Jackie Baillie and her comments about fair pay in the budget debate earlier on. And I genuinely was sitting there listening and wondering, what did Jackie Baillie do when she was a minister in the then Scottish Executive, when Labour councils up and down Scotland were paying women a lot less, male colleagues were doing similar, same jobs? That issue of equal pay, it was there for decades, and the Labour Party didn't do anything about it. Clearly, Equal pay and treating female workers wasn't a priority for the Labour Party then. In September 2020, the Scottish Government published a consultation on involved tax policy choices for the budget to 2021-22 and also the fiscal framework in line with its commitment to engage in tax policy. Tax policy is fundamental to any country's ability to support its economy and rebuild after a period of crisis. And let's face it, we all know with COVID, we are going to have to do a lot of rebuilding. The time is right to consider the devolution of additional tax powers to Scotland. However, certainly those of us from an SNP persuasion, also from the Greens, why limit ourselves with just that? That's why I believe that the powers of independence coming to this Parliament is vital to actually help deliver the country that we should all want to see for the people of Scotland. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr Macmillan. And can I call Shona Robertson to be followed by Liz Smith?
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I welcome today's motion, and I do believe that it delivers on the Government's commitment to a fairer and more progressive tax system. One which will continue to protect lower and middle income taxpayers while raising additional revenue for essential public services and the economy. I also welcome the announcement that in order to deliver certainty for taxpayers and stability for revenues, that there will be no changes to income tax rates this year. As we recover from the pandemic, it's important that households and families are supported at this difficult time, and today's rates resolution will ensure that no Scottish taxpayer will pay more income tax in 2021-22 than they do now on their current income. This will be welcome news to households across Scotland who have been struggling with the effects of COVID-19 on their incomes. Recent analysis from the Office of the Chief Economist, looking at the distributional impact of the Government's income tax policy choices over this parliamentary session, has shown that the Scottish Government's decisions have been redistributive and have protected low-income taxpayers. Over 77% of Scottish income taxpayers will pay less tax in 2021-22. Taxpayers in the middle of the income distribution will pay £135 less in tax in 2021-22. And the lowest earning 20% of income taxpayers will see the largest decrease in tax, while the highest earning 10% of taxpayers will see the largest increase in tax, and that is how it should be. In terms of the 2021-22 budget, the rates set out today are forecast to raise an additional £475 million in revenue. And this is money that we can use to support our health service, invest in a greener, fairer economy, and as part of our recovery from COVID-19. This is, of course, an incredibly challenging economic, health and social landscape within which to make tax policy decisions, which is very challenging, with unprecedented uncertainty, in particular due to the impacts of COVID-19, but also the EU exit. This challenge is made only harder by the delay to the UK budget, which means that we don't know what the full suite of UK tax, fiscal and economic policies will be before making our own policy decisions. Very challenging indeed. However, I think it's important, and the Scottish Government has tried to be as open as possible over our policies to provide certainty and stability, and I would urge the UK Government to do the same. I think the Scottish Government's approach to setting policy is to be commended and should serve as a good example, and one which the UK Government could certainly learn from. In September, the Government published a consultation on its tax policy, seeking the views of individuals and organisations on what their tax priorities were and what the challenges for the future would be. I think this initiative is hugely important and one that we need to build on if we are to effectively reflect and incorporate the hopes and aspirations of the people of Scotland in our planning of what a future Scotland should look like. And I look forward to learning more about how we can ensure that this voice is at the centre of our policy decision-making process going forward. So I welcome today's announcements, which I do think build on our commitment to a fairer and more progressive tax system in very difficult times. I think it provides certainty and stability for taxpayers, and I look forward to hearing how the Scottish Government plans to strengthen the contribution of individuals and organisations on their priorities in relation to taxation going forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms Robertson. I call Liz Smith to be followed by Bob Doris.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In recent weeks, we've seen several debates in this chamber about the economic priorities which will be required when it comes to Scotland emerging from the pandemic. And whilst there are undoubtedly different policy priorities across the political parties, as we've seen this afternoon, I think there's a genuine desire to see that people's jobs, investment and economic growth are the main focus. Crucial to that, of course, is the question of tax. Indeed, almost every economic briefing that was being given to members by the business community highlights just that, since they are naturally desperate for increased consumer spending as soon as possible to boost the Scottish economy. So it is good news that the SNP has for once listened to the Scottish Conservatives and frozen income tax this year. Although, as Murdo Fraser rightly said, it is to be hoped that this time, unlike the pledges that they made in 2016, they do keep their promises. To raise taxes at any time does not sit easily with the Scottish Conservatives, but especially just now when so many families and businesses are so hard up. So we very much welcome the announcement from the SNP that there is to be an income tax freeze for 21-22. Now, Mr McKee, in his speech, read out some comments from the business community, and he is quite right that in the circumstances, with jobs being lost all the time, a further move to hit take-home pay would be serious and further jeopardise economic recovery. And of course, on recent evidence, raising taxes has not worked in terms of drawing in sufficient additional revenue. And we all know what happens in circumstances when the resulting borrowing has to increase. We end up being saddled with more debt. And that, at the same time as increasing unemployment and reduced employment, clearly diminishes the tax base, and that's not a good thing. So can I turn to a few of the themes that I spoke about when this Parliament debated the Environment Committee's report on the green recovery just a few weeks ago? Because that was a good debate in terms of flushing out from each party where the main economic impetus should be. And for me, there were two aspects to that. Firstly, stakeholders are asking this Parliament to undertake careful consideration of where Government, Westminster and Holyrood should invest public money to deliver best value, and what incentives would be needed to stimulate both sectors to invest in key infrastructure projects, because that investment is going to be absolutely crucial for jobs. Just about every witness that we've heard at the Eclair Committee in recent months has been pushing for accelerated investment in infrastructure and for greater commitment to that in the Scottish Budget. And in this respect, effective procurement is essential, and that is something which the committee's report clearly identified as critical when it comes to aligning funding with infrastructure development and capital investment. Now, the role of the new Scottish Investment Bank is very welcome, but it can only succeed if there is very willing cooperation between the private, public and indeed the third sectors, with full focus on delivering best value for money, including on a regional basis as well as a national basis. Presiding Officer, time is short in this debate, so I'll conclude my remarks on the importance of tax policy, creating the necessary incentives to ensure that there is a boost in consumer spending, an increase in optimism for the business sector, which in so many ways has been bearing the brunt of this COVID-19 pandemic, and ensuring that Scotland is an attractive place in which to invest. These are not easy times, Presiding Officer, but we have a collective responsibility to ensure that we are giving Scotland every chance to recover.
Thank you very much, Ms Smith. Can I call Bob Doris to be followed by Emma Harper?
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. But a while since I've been in the Parliament in person, and I have to say, speaking to today's debate, I wasn't sure how positive or constructive it would be, but in the most part, actually, I think it has been quite positive and constructive, not just from the government benches, but I think from the Lib Dem and Green benches also, and that was good to see. I'm pleased to speak in this short debate on the Scottish rate resolution. If agreed today, these rates and bans will come into place from the 6th of April this year. I note that these rates come with a forecast to raise an additional £475 million for the 2021-22 Scottish Budget, money that is clearly essential and needed. On these assumptions, the majority, 54% of Scottish taxpayers, will pay slightly less income tax in 2021-2022 and that they would if they lived elsewhere in the UK. Now, that's not a competition, but it does give a relative perspective into the the priorities of income tax vis-à-vis Scotland and the rest of the UK. That 54% are the taxpayers in the lower and basic rates. The tax policy therefore seeks to protect those on lowest incomes, and I very much welcome that. Of course, the Scottish income tax bands are progressive, and therefore those in higher incomes brackets will of course pay a bit more. That is self-evident. I think it's important during the current COVID-19 pandemic to have as much certainty and stability at this time within our tax system, and the rates resolution provides this. And actually that was across all the parties, and I think that was good to see. However, there will clearly be a need to continue to engage with the wider public and stakeholders as to how our tax system can deliver the healthier, wealthier, fairer and greener Scotland we all want to see in terms of how we fund that. We will at some point have to go further than we're going this afternoon. That won't just mean a frank and open discussion as to how we might use the current income tax flexibilities that we possess differently, but also what further devolution of tax and fiscal levers might look like in this place to achieve those ambitions. It's not just about necessarily increasing taxes to fund the country we want to be, but broadening that tax base in this place also. That's very important. I very much hope we can get to a position in Scotland's Parliament where the money we raise in tax is agreed as an investment into the kind of society we wish to see, and not weaponised by political parties, by some parties more than others, but at times by all parties, as a way of scoring party political points. And I think in that respect, perhaps the Conservatives should reflect on their contributions here this afternoon. I appreciate that is particularly challenging in the run-up to an election, so it may be that we have to come together as a Parliament after May this year to make real progress on this, but I think the vast majority of this Parliament are moving in the same direction. That said, I welcome the Scottish Government's consultation and devolved taxes as a genuine attempt to promote that debate in a positive and constructive fashion. When we look at the taxes we pay as a nation, we should be looking to see not just the taxes we pay, but the assistance and services that we secure for society. That is important, as tax is directed often on individuals, but the benefit is accrued by society, and that's the social contract that I hope we all sign up to in this chamber. So, be that supporting carers with the Carers Allowance Supplement, a 19% increase in the financial support to unpaid carers, on Scotland's new game-changing Scottish Child Payment, £40 per child every 4 weeks in our lowest income households, or increasing eligibility to free school meals and looking to move to a universal free school meals all year round for primary school children. It's the social contract. Be it the NHS that is remarkable despite the clear challenges it is under, or the investment in our schools through the Attainment Fund, £750 million in the lifetime of this Parliament, and the People Equity Fund, which will see schools in my constituency in the coming financial year get an additional £3.3 million to further boost attainment, something I greatly welcome. There may be different political choices in how we spend money raised in this place, and I get that. That's only one side of the equation, but I hope where we do get consensus this afternoon is that the tax we pay is for the benefit of all of society, and with that in mind I will be supporting this afternoon's rates resolution.
Thank you very much, Mr Doris. And can I call Emma Harper before we move to closing speeches? Emma Harper.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I welcome the opportunity to speak in this debate on Scottish Government's Rate Resolution Settlement 21-22. Last time I spoke in this debate, I was a member of the Finance and Constitution Committee, and many members this afternoon have spoke about and recognised the work of Bruce Crawford, and I want to add my name to recognise his able way as an MSP, as a convener and as a parliamentarian. I'm pleased to speak about how the rate resolution proposals will directly benefit people across Dumfries and Galloway, and indeed the rest of Scotland. The Scottish Government's income tax policy proposals for this upcoming financial year maintain our commitment to a fairer and more progressive tax system, protecting lower and middle income taxpayers while raising additional revenue to invest in public services and Scotland's economy and the COVID-19 recovery. And it is worth repeating what Stuart McMillan and Bob Doris said when they said in 2021-22, the majority, 54% of Scottish taxpayers will pay less tax than they would if they lived elsewhere in the UK, which, as a result of financial hardship caused by the pandemic, is extremely welcome. To this end, and to deliver stability and certainty from the tax system for people in Scotland, there will be no non-inflation changes to the Scottish income tax rates this year. This includes increasing the starter band, basic band and higher rate of income tax by inflation only, and a freeze of top rate threshold and income tax in cash terms at £150,000. This will allow people and families across Scotland room to support economic recovery from the pandemic. This is an incredibly challenging economic, health and social landscape within which to make tax policy decisions with unprecedented uncertainty, in particular due to the impact of COVID-19 and the EU exit. The current landscape is exacerbated by the delay to the UK budget, which means that we do not know what the full suite of UK tax, fiscal and economic policies will be before making our own Scottish policy decisions. The Scottish Government's focus is now on delivering tax policies that will help and support Scotland's economy to recover in 2021 and 2022 and beyond, recognising the role tax can play in supporting the individuals and businesses most affected. In response to these challenges, the tax package set out by the Scottish Government supports the economy and underlines its recognition of the commitment to tackling the inequalities further exposed by COVID-19. Presiding Officer, I welcome the Government's announcement that the revenues raised from taxation will support the most comprehensive range of free-to-access public services in the UK, as well as the ongoing COVID-19 support. This package of a budget that invests in Scotland's recovery, supporting the individuals and businesses most affected, and again I make an appeal to the Cabinet Secretary to ensure that no Dumfries and Galloway or indeed any Scottish business is missed or left to fall through any cracks. Presiding Officer, the Scottish Government has been clear that this is not the time for sweeping reforms of the tax system for fiscal consolidation. Indeed, leading fiscal commentators, including the OECD, agree that now is not the time to balance the books and that the time for any tax rises is when the recovery is firmly underway. The IFS has said that tax rises should not be implemented anytime soon and that substantial tax rises should not be part of the coming UK budget. I agree that it is time for stability and certainty, with targeted support for individuals and businesses who have been most impacted by COVID-19. Presiding Officer, in conclusion, the Scottish Government's focus is rightly on delivering tax policies that will support Scotland's people and the economic recovery this year and beyond, which I welcome. The rate resolution settlement combined with the budget will support the response to COVID-19 and will support people and families across Scotland, and I call on the UK Government to act similarly. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms Harper. And we move to closing speeches. Can I call on James Kelly to be followed by Maurice Golden? James Kelly.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I'm pleased to close this important debate on the rate resolution. As Murdo Fraser says, the debate this year comes at an unusual time in proceedings, before stage 2 and also before we've got the publication of the UK budget. Scottish Labour understands there needs to be certainty around tax rates and won't oppose the rate resolution tonight. However, the way taxes are set has a direct link to the budget, and there are some important issues that need to be flushed out here and debated, not only this afternoon, but for the future as we look to how we recover from the pandemic. I think the tax rates that the SNP have set out don't match up to their rhetoric since they've been granted the tax-raising powers. We've heard much this afternoon from SNP members, including Ivan McKee, about how progressive the system is, but the reality is the bands are far too wide. If you take the difference between the higher rate and the top rate threshold, that runs from 43,662 to 150,000. That means that a senior nurse would be paying the same rate of tax as a CEO in a top company. That can't be fair. Also, in terms of how the top rate threshold has been frozen, therefore effectively given an inflationary tax cut to 18,000 taxpayers in that band. I wonder when Ivan McKee was running through his consultation that he was espousing greatly about, if anybody was telling him that that represented fairness in the tax system, because I don't believe it did. And as Jackie Bailey pointed out, sadly the effects of the pandemic mean that those on the lower rates will suffer more disruption to their lives, potentially lose jobs, working less hours, and therefore, are in more difficult circumstances than those in those on the top rates, who in many cases have been protected. I think that all this matters because how much you raise in tax directly affects what you can do in the budget. And I think because of the government's lacklustre ambition in relation to tax, we see the impact in the actual budget itself. I mean, it can't be right, as was reflected in the previous debate, when sadly we see the number of homeless people dying on the increase again, that there are cuts in the homeless budget. I know more money has been introduced, but there's still less money available for housing in the budget, and that is unacceptable. In addition to that, if we want to achieve the ambition of rewarding care workers fairly and paying them £15 an hour, we need a tax system that matches up the revenue raised in order to deliver that. I think the other thing to reflect on going forward is that in terms of the forecast, obviously, as the SFC have noted, clearly the pandemic is going to have a major impact going forward. Could well be that employment levels will be affected in the rest of this year, particularly when the furlough scheme comes to an end, and that could significantly reduce tax revenues. One of the forecasts indicates it could be £500 million less going forward, and that will have an impact on future Scottish budgets. Therefore, I think what we need going forward is we need an understanding of the issues that we face coming out of the pandemic, the reality that people's not only lives but jobs and incomes are going to be disrupted, and therefore we need to look at a fair tax system going forward in order that it is able to fund the budget properly, in order to make demands so that we can set a budget that recovers from the pandemic, properly supports the NHS to deal with the backlog that's going to exist, and supports our pupils and students in the school system, many of whom have been disenfranchised throughout this school year. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much, Mr Kelly. And can I call on Maurice Golden to close for the Scottish Conservatives?
Thank you, Presiding Officer. There are usually two certainties with the Scottish budget: taxes going up and a pantomime from the Greens pretending they might not support it. I'm pleased to say at least one of those traditions has been broken this year, with the income tax rates frozen at long last. I very much welcome that, and that ministers have listened to the Scottish Conservatives on this, as Bill Bowman highlighted that it is unfair to burden hard-working Scots with more taxes. Presiding Officer, for the government to make more of people's hard-earned wage packets right now would only pile more pressure on already struggling families. With businesses on their knees, jobs being lost and families facing tough times, every penny they can keep in their pocket makes things that little bit easier. And we know the public does not want to see tax hikes. At the last Scottish parliamentary election in 2016, almost two-thirds of voters backed parties promising no tax rises. As Liz Smith highlighted, the Scottish Conservatives keep their promises. Ivan McKee said he wants taxes which deliver for Scotland. I agree with that, and in fact, I agreed with him and the SNP in 2016. Sadly, the SNP went back to break their manifesto promise not to raise taxes, raising taxes for over 1 million Scots, in turn making Scotland the highest taxed part of the UK, and even those on moderate salaries of just over £27,000 paying more than they would elsewhere in the UK. Murdo Fraser highlighted this broken promise, as well as the broken promise from the SNP to raise the personal allowance to £12,750, making it clear you cannot trust the SNP on tax. In fact, the last Finance Secretary didn't even understand basic economics. But, Presiding Officer, the fundamental problem with this strategy of hiking taxes has been that it has not actually worked. Income tax revenue has been lower than expected. Reconciliations in the 2018-19 budget have been blown a £300 million hole in this budget. That will have to be filled by borrowing £309 million, saddling the taxpayer with more debt, debt that is already costing £66 million in repayments this year alone. But if the high tax strategy has not worked so far, the pandemic makes it even less likely that it will in the future. 123,000 Scots are currently out of work, and new figures released this week show the employment rate dipping, so the tax base is being eroded. Presiding Officer, the situation would be far worse if it had not been for the massive support package deployed by the Conservative British Government. Their furlough scheme has protected almost 1 million Scottish jobs. If those had been lost, the effect on the economy would have been catastrophic. As it is, the British Government has now spent a staggering £20 billion to support Scotland through this pandemic. Over £12 billion of that has been used to increase the Scottish budget into 2022. But even as we now see some hope from the incredible success of the UK's vaccine programme, the economic effects of the pandemic will be with us for years to come. The Scottish Fiscal Commission are forecasting that it will be at least 2024 before the economy returns to pre-pandemic levels. So, jobs must continue to be an economic priority, and the SNP should be focused on protecting existing jobs and creating new ones to expand the tax base and grow the economy. Presiding Officer, we know that was not happening before the pandemic. Scotland already had the lowest rate of business growth and job creation in the UK. In fact, the slower rate of job creation means the SNP have effectively cost Scotland over 260,000 jobs since they came to power in 2007. Now that we are looking to recovery efforts, it is important those failings are not repeated. Instead, we have by now seen a concrete plan for a green recovery, with this budget putting the funding for that in place. Instead, we see the SNP cutting funding for the very things that would help create new, well-paid jobs and expand the economy in a more sustainable manner. For example, the rail infrastructure budget has been cut by £33 million, whilst the newly launched Scottish National Investment Bank's budget is already down £36 million. Perhaps most worryingly, though, is the £66 million cut to the innovation and industry budget. And these cuts come on top of the underfunding of Scottish universities, the institutions that should be driving innovation, research and attracting new investment. They requested £206 million to make the sector financially viable. The SNP provided just £6 million. These are the wrong choices to fund a green recovery, build more resilient services and create better jobs. So, just as the Scottish Conservatives have already put a stop to tax hikes this year, we will keep pushing the SNP to make the right choices.
Thank you very much, Mr Golden. And can I call on the Minister, Ivan McKee, to conclude our debate?
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I thank members for their contribution. And in a moment, I'll turn to reflect on the points raised during this debate. But before I do, just let me remind the Chamber that just a few hours ago we debated the budget at stage 1 and now stand before the Chamber asking members to vote for this rate resolution. The Scottish Government is not willing to delay important decisions about income tax to allow for the inability of the UK Government to produce their budget. And it's hugely disappointing that once again the Scottish budget is being debated and delivered without the assumptions of the UK budget to underpin it. Another year when we've had to base our judgments on outdated forecasts and partial information. So I want to pick up on some of the members' contributions this afternoon. And first up, I can reflect on Murdo Fraser's contribution and welcome his agreement to our tax policy, and that's very welcome. Comment on his the fact that, as the Cabinet Secretary was saying during his speech, that we've actually reduced the tax rate for the majority of taxpayers in Scotland, making Scotland the lowest tax part of the UK, something I want to come back on and talk to, commenting on some of the comments that Patrick Harvey made. Yes, Sharon, you go.
I'm very grateful to the Minister for giving way. Would you like to take this opportunity to apologise for the 2 broken promises on tax from his party?
Ivan McKee.
What I wouldn't like to apologise for is the fact that the majority of taxpayers in Scotland now pay less tax than they do in the rest of the UK, and that's what talks to our progressive tax policy that we've implemented as the Scottish Government. I want to talk about the comments Murdo Fraser made on the fiscal framework, because the fiscal framework doesn't, as he said, protect Scottish tax revenue. What it does do is allows for the Scottish Government, through the tax policies we implement, to be able to generate additional revenue, provided that the Scottish tax base performs at least as well as the tax base in the rest of the UK. And through the tax policies and other economic policies that this Government has adopted, that has indeed been the case. Not only has the tax policies in Scotland performed better than they have across the rest of the UK over the lifetime of this Parliament, that will deliver an additional £930 million to be spent in Scotland as a consequence of that improved performance and that superior performance in Scotland in delivering on the tax base compared to the rest of the UK. Turning to talk about, reflect on Willie Rennie's comments. I'm glad he recognises this is a time for stability, something that's at the core of the Scottish budget. And also agree with him that the Conservatives are indeed confused when it comes to this. I do comment on his observation that we now have a more mature consideration in this Parliament, and his comment that that's due to us having more powers to be able to talk about tax and spend. Indeed, I would go further, and I'm sure Willie Rennie, being the very perceptive individual is, will also make this link that the more powers that the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish Government have, then we could have an even more mature consideration of balance on these issues. In fact, the devolution of further tax powers, I'm sure he would consequently support, and perhaps going the whole way and devolving all powers to this Parliament when we're independent would be something worth he might want to consider in due course as well. He does make a very interesting point about the impact of tax measures and behavioural changes. He will be aware that the work of the Scottish Fiscal Commission does on this to model those tax income elasticities and the range of measures that they use to do that, and the work that's undergoing to help to understand those. But as he rightly points out, the effect of the tax policies that we have taken has been that we haven't seen that significant behavioural change at the top end of the tax rate. We've judged it, I think, very effectively. We've positioned those tax increases at the point on the Laffer curve, to comment on one of Mr Fraser's favourite. We've positioned it at the point where we have been able to leverage additional. How's it
coming on? Order, please.
I shall. Leverage additional, if you be quiet and let me continue, leverage additional revenue from those tax increases without reaching the point at which it becomes counterproductive. And indeed, HMRC's modelling on the tax income elasticities comes in at 0.48, and the SFC's got a range from 0.1 up to about 0.7 at the top end. So yeah, I'm just comment on the Laffer curve, because I think this is where, it's a shame we didn't have the opportunity to listen this year to Murdo Fraser pretending he did understand the Laffer Laffer curve. Because while the Laffer curve does say that not... Listen, you might learn something. But the Laffer curve indeed does say that not all increases in tax rates result in an increase in tax revenue. What it does absolutely not say, is that all increases in tax rates result in a reduction in tax revenues, nor does it argue that all decreases in tax rates result in an increase in tax revenue. I'm sure I think you did if you go back and listen to what you've actually said. That's why, Mr Fraser, it's a curve and not a straight line. What's important to understand is where the point of inflection is, and you do that by looking at the tax income elasticities. And if you've been listening to what I said, you might have learned something. So, moving on to talk about the comment of Patrick Harvey. I agree with him, the role of tax needs to be looked at, but I think then he also got a bit confused about where he was going with this, because I'm not quite sure exactly what his message is here, because he's saying that the fact that the Scottish tax system delivers for the majority of taxpayers a lower tax payment than they would make in the rest of the UK. Is he saying that that is not a good thing? Is he saying that, and this is something the Green Manifesto is going to have, that they're going to argue for increases on taxes on the lower paid members of our communities? I'm sure that's what he not means, but as I say, what he came across was quite confused. And also with regard to his comments on Greenports, and again it is what Patrick Harvey is saying, is that we shouldn't be arguing for payment and enforcing payment of the real living wage, that we shouldn't be enforcing no zero-hour contracts, that we shouldn't be taking those steps to tackle the gender pay gap, and we shouldn't be taking steps to accelerate the net zero transition, which is precisely what is happening within those Greenports. And it was very interesting, because just to digress for a minute, when Mark Ruskell came to the session that I ran, he was listening to what we said and was fairly supportive of the comments that we made, and could find no points to argue against, but clearly went back to his boss. He was given the line, and the line is that the Greens have an ideological opposition to generating economic activity, it seems, which of course is what pays for our public services. I shall.
I don't know if you can enlighten the Chamber. Is this the end of the love-in between the Greens and the SNP?
Minister Ivan McKee.
You and the SNP. You're the new Patrick.
I couldn't possibly comment. Now, in terms of that's above my pay grade. So, in terms of other contributions in the last couple of minutes I've got left. Bill Bowman talked about various gaps, and at one point it was quite a large gap in his narrative as he wandered through. But to pick up on the specific point that he made on armed forces and an intervention from the Cabinet Secretary, it's important to recognise that while the Conservatives talk about higher paid members of the armed forces and the differential in tax, that for the lower paid ranks in the services, of course, they benefit from a lower rate of tax in Scotland than they would across the UK, the rest of the UK. And the point the Cabinet Secretary was making was that perhaps the Conservatives should go and argue for that benefit for privates and others across the armed forces that are working in England to benefit also through a UK government intervening to give them a lower tax rate that they would have enjoyed had they been stationed in Scotland. Several members reflected on the importance of stability and certainty, absolutely at the core of what we're offering as part of this budget. And I can mention Shona Robinson and Bob Doris and others in that regard. James Kelly's intervention, again, he really should reflect on the fact that the progressive nature of the budget that the Scottish Government has delivered and continues to deliver means that the majority of taxpayers in Scotland pay less tax than they would across the rest of the UK, and through the measures we've taken, as I said already, the additional revenues that's been generated at £930 million that above the block grant adjustment that's available in Scotland to be spent on public services beyond what would otherwise have been the case. And Elizabeth comments again, another Conservative complimenting our approach and referencing the significant business support for what we've delivered. But the important point she makes on procurement is well made. It's an area that I've got responsibility for, and working hard to see what additional steps we can take to leverage that public sector procurement to support the growth of Scottish business. So just to conclude, Presiding Officer, the decisions we make on tax are often passionately debated across this chamber and in homes across the country. This reflects the fact that income tax affects everyone, whether through the tax we pay on our salaries or in its role to fund the public services we'll rely on in our daily lives. And there will be a time in the future when we once again ask to debate changes to the tax system, but that time is is not now. The proposals in front of you today reflect the income tax system that Scotland needs now. They protect household budgets and maintain spending power in real terms. They preserve our progressive tax system that continues to protect low-income earners, and they provide the certainty and stability people need from the tax system. I therefore invite members to support the proposals in this rate resolution. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr McKee. And that concludes our debate on the Scottish rate resolution. Now, Rule 11.3.1 requires the question on the Scottish rate resolution to be put immediately after the debate. So the question, therefore, is that motion 24225 in the name of Kate Forbes on the Scottish rate resolution be agreed? Are we all agreed? We're not agreed. So we're going to move to a division. I'm going to suspend Parliament for a few moments to allow members to access the voting app. Parliament is suspended.